This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Good morning and welcome to Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond once again at our popular broadcast time of 10 AM on a Saturday morning.
For the football.
Yes, Alex, as ever, before the football, as you rightly say, and before the two exciting Scottish Cup semi-finals, where the Old Firm will be tested by Aberdeen and Heart of Midlothian, respectively. I mention this because some of you have got the strange idea that I know nothing about the beautiful game. Well, as a veteran of Scotland's Euro qualification campaign, just let me say, it is vital that Steve Clarke gives Lawrence Shankland an extended run in the Scotland team.
Well, stop, Taz. We believe you. But now I think we have to turn to today's programme because we're looking at the international situation. So tell us what's on the show today, Taz.
Well, today we turn to the deteriorating international crisis. Conflagration and escalation threatens the entire Middle East. Some seem to have a vested interest in spreading the conflict from disaster in Gaza to a general war, seeing an irrepressible conflict between Israel and the Palestinian people and the Muslim states. Over the last quarter of a century of mounting conflict between the West and Islam, one voice has remained strong for peace and resolution. He is Professor Akbar Ahmed of the American University in Washington. Alex spoke to him earlier this week.
And joining me from Washington, D.C. is one of Islam's most notable academics, Professor Akbar Ahmed. Professor Akbar Ahmed, welcome to Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Thank you so much, Alex. So always a pleasure to see you. You represent the best of a noble and wise people.
You're just ingratiating yourself with me, Akbar, but keep talking, it'll definitely work. Now listen, let's look after, just for the benefit of our viewers, your last quarter of a century of work, which you've been principally pursuing in academia in the United States, has been dedicated to the effort to try and get a reconciliation and understanding between the Western world and Islam. Do you feel that you're making progress in that high ideal?
Alex, I asked the same question of my partner, Bishop John Chain, who is the bishop here in Washington, and working with Senior Rabbi Bruce Lustig. And we three, after 9/11, formed the first Abraham Summit. So I would ask them just to compare notes over the last 2 decades. And they said it's like that biblical character that you climb up a mountain and the rock rolls back and then the next day again you start. So it's a process that really is, I think, going to constantly occupy us. We can't just relax and let the boulder squash humanity.
I mean, you've lectured, been held professorships at Harvard, Princeton, now at the American University. Do you feel that there is a receptive audience for the message that you are articulating? Do you feel that among your students and the television audiences that you address?
Students, yes, because you have a face-to-face meeting with them and there's a human interaction. But looking at the world, Alex, and I think it's good that we mention that, if you see the big thinkers, if you see Kissinger or Noam Chomsky or Professor John Mearsheimer from Chicago, they give a very gloomy picture of the world today. They consider it's very dangerous. We are at a point in history and that we really have to pull back from the brink before it's all over. And that concerns me because I see it in terms of two images. One is Edvard Munch, the famous painting of a man on a bridge who is shrieking and holding his ears like this. And around him, there are apocalyptic scenes and colors, very frightening. And that picture to me is not looking at the 20th century because he painted it at the end of the 19th, but he's really seeing or foreseeing the 21st century. Because if you look around you, Alex, all around you, there's violence, there's killing, children are being killed, women are being killed, and people seem to have lost the emotion of compassion, of love, of reaching out to each other. So it's a really bad time, and all the phobias, there's anti-Semitism, there's Islamophobia, there's this phobia and that phobia. They've been unleashed like some witch's coil. This, by the way, I think is from Alex, you'll appreciate, from Macbeth.
Well, when we met at first, Akbar, you were the High Commissioner for Pakistan at the Court of St. James. And we got a real good understanding as you visited Scotland and the Pakistani community in Scotland. And we thought that the world had many challenges then. But I mean, since then, we've had 9/11, we've had 20 years of the war on terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, 1 million people dead, and now the threatened conflagration in the Middle East. I mean, it does seem that, as you rightly say, the world is getting an ever more dangerous place. In that background, do you see some chinks of light, some cause for hope? Is there a way forward?
I do, Alex, because I gave you one image that is of Edvard Munch's painting of the Scream. But opposed to that, there is another image, and I want your viewers to keep this in mind, and that is of the famous mystic Sufi poet of love, Rumi. Now, Rumi has many, many verses which speak from the heart. And remember, he's writing, Alex, in a sort of similar time. History is different for every generation, but sort of similar when the Muslim world is being attacked by the Mongols on one side and the Crusaders on the other side. And Rumi is writing poems of love. So he's basically saying we need to fall back into ourselves and rediscover our capacity to love. His famous lines, I go to the synagogue, I go to the church, I go to the mosque, and I see the same altar and I see the same spirit. It is calling out for us to embrace each other. So I think we do have hope, and I've found in my lectures, documentaries, talking to people responding very positively, very warmly, as indeed you did, Alex, when we came to see you in Edinburgh and record you for my documentary journey into Europe.
You've written recently in some of your recent works about the golden age of Islam that you're referring to now, and how that was represented not just in poets, but also in the great military leader Saladin, whose renowned chivalry and generosity to his opponents set such an example. But surely Saladin is remembered because he was unusual in his chivalry and generosity. He wasn't the norm. He stood out from the savagery of the period.
Alex, Saladin is one of the favorite characters, not only of mine as a Muslim, I'm very proud of him, but also of many, many non-Muslim, including, again, some of your very famous novelists in Scotland, precisely because he represented chivalry, warmth, generosity. I mean, when in history, and we are talking about the Middle East now, when you're seeing so much hatred and vitriol on both sides and people are not even prepared to talk to each other, you have the conqueror of Jerusalem. He takes Jerusalem back from the Crusades and he helps the prisoners. He's got all these Christian prisoners who cannot afford a ransom. He pays for them from his own estate. And then he orders the bringing back of the Jewish community who had been banned by the Crusaders. Who does this in history? That is what he was doing. And he said, I am doing this simply as a good Muslim. That's what I'm commanded to do as a Muslim. So I won't say he's the only one. He was a very successful one. But many, many people in that golden age were working together, were creating a society and civilization together. Alex, it's remarkable how Andalusia, for example, in Spain, created a society where you had Jews and Christians and Muslims actually working together and creating a very flourishing society. It didn't last over a few centuries. In the end, as you know, there was a falling of the guillotine and it just ended. But for centuries, you did have a period when you could look back and hope. And that's what my message is to Europe. And you asked this question, the word I take from Spain, it's a Spanish word, is la convivencia, which is working together, cooperating together so that societies are able to live together like different flowers in a garden, not imposing one on top of another, but living together in common respect and dignity. And that was La Convivencia. And for a time, we got a glimpse from Andalusia. And I'm sorry to say that Europe does not know about this today, and Europe seems to be forgetting this great lesson that we can learn for not only Europe, but for the rest of the world today.
Now, the Scottish author you mentioned, of course, was Sir Walter Scott, who wrote Ivanhoe and held Sarhadin in such high regard. He also wrote a book called Tales from a Grandfather's Knee, which was the celebrated events in Scottish history told from a grandfather's knee. Do you think if we could find inspiration from great historical figures, that would still be a light and an enlightenment for a younger generation?
Absolutely, because I talk to a lot of young people on campuses and all over the world. I travel, as you know, and talk. And I find again and again that people really need to be told, literally as teachers talking to students, they're thirsting for knowledge, and they're thirsting for this kind of knowledge because they're living in a world which has been compartmentalized. So a lot of Muslims may not even know about these great figures from history. For example, how many Muslims would know about Rabbi Maimonides, the great Jewish rabbi? Now, the great Jewish rabbi from Cordoba leaves Cordoba, he's exiled from there. Where does he land up? He becomes the medical physician to Sultan Salahuddin, this great figure we are talking about. Alex, think of this, it's mind-blowing. The physician who administers medicine to the greatest Muslim ruler of his time is a Jewish rabbi. I mean, just think of this. Could this happen in reverse anywhere in the world today? That's the kind of civilization that was evident before us and existing at that time in history. So yes, these are examples that people need to know, and vice versa. I think a lot of Israelis and Jewish people would need to know about examples of like Salahuddin, of Maimonides himself, where these individuals were acting as bridge builders, as ambassadors between cultures. This is what we need desperately. So in order for the world to move ahead, this terrible 21st century which is forming around us, you need those figures. And you really, Alex, you have to play your role in history by being very clear and very determined in this vision for the future. Or we are all lost. Not just me, not just you, but all of us are lost.
So let's turn to the situation we have now in the Middle East and the disaster that's unfolded in Gaza and the risk of escalation now between Israel and Iran. And wider afield, of course. I mean, what are your thoughts on that danger, that conflagration at the present moment?
First of all, profound sorrow at the deaths that are taking place, Alex, and we see them on television. We see them, children, infants being blown up and killed, and buildings being mosques, centuries old being blown up. And on both sides, you had that terrible 7th October event when the Palestinians crossed over into Israel and killed so many Israelis. And then, of course, we have this unending massacre that's taking place. And how can you even condole or even justify either of these? You have to step back and say, as human beings, we cannot either approve or even accept this. This must stop. Now, when I say profound sadness, I'm aware that this could expand, this could extend, this could then envelope the entire Middle East. And from there, it could extend really beyond the Middle East, because you're not seeing a regional war, you're not seeing a regional conflict, you're seeing really a global conflict taking place. Because remember who's involved in this? The United States, the UK, France, Germany, Western countries involved in this bloodshed that's taking place in the Middle East. Now, on the other side, you've got Iran, which has launched all these missiles into Israel. None of them very effective, but nonetheless, they were launched. And who's supporting Iran? You've got Russia, you have China, you have North Korea. So suddenly you're seeing the possibility of the world at the point of 1914 Sarajevo, when the First World War began with that one shot, one assassination. So that is what makes me very sad, profoundly sad, but also profoundly worried that the unintended consequences, the law of unintended consequences. So we start with this situation in Israel, it escalates, you have the killings in Gaza, then Iran comes in, and suddenly you have the whole world involved in this. And at some point, Alex, the leaders of the world have to pull back, particularly, and I'm sorry to say this, as a great admirer and respecter of Western enlightenment, that the West, and by this I mean generally the Western countries and leadership, seem to have abandoned their greatest and richest legacy, which is ideas of humanity, of civil liberties, of compassion, which are rooted in this Enlightenment idea. And of course, I know how deeply rooted it is in Scotland. They seem to have just abandoned this. So, all right, we believe in these things, but only for us. We don't believe in this for the people in the Middle East or elsewhere. This was the time for people in the leadership to say it is a question of humanity. It's a question of all of us, not just me and mine.
Well, as you're well aware, Akbar, Scotland has a huge pro-Palestinian sentiment. And I suppose one of the questions that people in Scotland ask is, why is it not possible for an American president to pull the plug on a warmonger like Benjamin Netanyahu? Why doesn't he just tell him to get his jotters and get somebody with a bit of vision in as the Israeli Prime Minister? Why is that not possible? As somebody who's taught in America for the last quarter century, you must have a good understanding of the limitations of American power as well as its extent.
Well, Alex, you've used the word limitations. And as we know, this is America is probably one of the greatest illustrations of Western democracy. It is really an amazing country. It's a great country in every aspect of history, culture, achievement. And yet, the American president, who's often labeled the most powerful man in the world, has his limitations. And limitations are literally depending on elections. And this is an election year. We've got, in a couple of months, there'll be the elections, and one of the two candidates will be elected. And both of them are acutely aware that a small vote swinging one way or the other would affect the outcome. And therefore, you have their hands, as it were, tied. I think in normal circumstances, they would have acted very differently, because the American vision of the world, and you have to read the Founding Fathers, is rooted in ideas of pluralism, of respect for each other. Washington wrote one book, and it was titled Civility and Decent Behavior. So those are rules how to conduct civility and decent behavior everywhere. Now, what you're seeing is, in a sense, America putting that aside and saying, okay, what is my privilege? What is my advantage in terms of politics? And the moment you have that, Alex, and you know you've been dealing with politics all your life, you have compromises. And it is only an extraordinary leadership. These are people of vision who can rise above this, who can transcend that limitation. And that's why Salahuddin becomes so relevant in this area of the Middle East, where he is able to say, no, I'm releasing all the Christian prisoners who are soldiers. And his generals opposed him, his advisors opposed him, and they said, you're releasing all these soldiers, they're going to go and join King Richard and they'll fight against us. And he said, no, that's their decision. My decision is based on my understanding of my faith, which is to be generous and to be compassionate. And I'm going to pay for them and get them out to allow them to go home.
Do you think it would help, as a last question, if people in Israel understood that Salahuddin returned the Jews to Jerusalem after he conquered it?
Alex, I've talked to many Jewish communities. They're very intelligent, aware, one of the most impressive communities, as you know, in history, and their achievements are incredible, Nobel Prizes, awards. But again, the understanding of history as far as the Muslims are concerned really needs to be advanced or needs to be enhanced. Because when I talk to the Jewish community, I remind them that for centuries in Spain, for centuries in the Ottoman Empire, for example, I went to Bosnia as part of this project, and I met the chief representative of the Jewish community who told me this. He said, we don't know anti-Semitism. There is no anti-Semitism in Bosnia because this community has absorbed us and embraced us. And the Jews who were expelled from Spain, the Sephardic Jews, came here and they found homes and they're living here. So when the Muslims were under attack, they opened up their synagogues to the Muslims. So it isn't a black and white situation, but not many people know these examples. So one of the first ambassadors appointed by my friend Dr. Haris, who was Prime Minister of Bosnia Herzegovina, was Ambassador Finci, the head of the Jewish community. Now, I think that both communities, the Palestinians and the Israelis, would benefit from these examples. It would allow them to emerge from this cul-de-sac which they've created for themselves. Because, Alex, I'm sorry to say this, I'm not making a partisan point, but violence begets violence. You'll have more violence and more violence and more violence. This thing is not going to end well except in a cycle growing ever bigger and bigger in more violence. This has to stop, and it has to be reversed. And there are enough people of good sense and compassion on both sides who have to start that process. And if it's not done, then I'm afraid we will be seeing Edvard Munch's Scream for the world.
Well, let's hope not. And to you, Professor Akbar Ahmed, from all of Scotland, more strength to your elbow. Keep doing what you're doing, and we'll be right alongside you. Thank you so much, Akbar, for joining me on Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Thank you, Alex. And let me say that Scotland, Alex, which you represent, is a small land in terms of the physical, the geography, but a land for which I have immense respect. It's a land that's produced, you just quoted Sir Walter Scott, it's produced Sean Connery, it's produced McCartney, it's produced Alex Salmond. I mean, what richer society then you can have? At the same time, Alex, I hope and pray that Scotland's voice of sanity should be heard throughout the world today. So thank you, Alex, for inviting me and giving me this honor. Thank you.
And thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Welcome back. Now, last week's show featured the dangers to the SNP government of betraying its commitments to the Highlands of Scotland. This is what SNP rebel Fergus Ewing MSP and parliamentary petitioner Laura Hansler had to say about the duelling of the A9.
Well, it's never too late to start an apprenticeship, even at the age of 66, as a backbench hardened campaigner. But really, Laura has played a blinder in coming to the Petitions Committee, which is kind of the doorway to the Scottish Parliament for the public to walk through and bring issues of concern. And it's a great committee, and Laura's work has led to a fairly serious scrutiny of the serial failure, I'm afraid, of my own party to deliver on the promises which we made to dual the road by 2025. And meanwhile, sadly, tragically, people continue to lose their lives. So we're fighting a just cause, but Laura's really got it onto the agenda, and that's the Scottish Parliament system. It's about people coming through that door to the Petitions Committee to get things done for Scotland.
So, Laura, is it the aspect of the A9 as a killer road, to use the normal description? Is that what has really exercised you in this campaign?
I think, you know, sitting in one of the communities that lies directly on the A9, there's only so much you can take. There's only so many sirens you can hear during peak holiday season. And every time you start to think, when will it be my loved one? You know, you sit with your heart in your mouth. So for me, having a social conscience, I'd had enough at this point in time.
And this is what you thought. Tartandon says, the Greens need to be realistic. People need to travel between cities safely and efficiently. To prioritise cyclists is crazy. To ban wood-burning stoves is crazy. SNP better shake off this tail wagging the dog partnership. Geronimo says, brilliant episode as always. Keep up all the great work. I'm already looking forward to watching next week. As a viewer, it does seem like a very slick operation you have with the show. Scotland's future, Scotland's choice. Well, Geronimo, let me just say in terms of a slick operation, that's entirely down to the production team of Zulfikar, Rob, Callum and indeed myself. Indie Boy says, that was educational for myself personally after listening to Fergus Ewing and Laura Hansler. I underestimated the seriousness of the A9, of its current condition, and that it's been the cause of deaths. It has to be duelled and needs that guarantee it will happen. And finally, Elizabeth Blackley says, these shows are brilliant, not only giving so much unknown Scottish history, but also letting us ordinary people know how much we have been let down by the SNP in recent years. As I've said before, should be on BBC Scotland so that everyone can access it, old and young. Well, thank you very much indeed, Elizabeth. I'm not sure that BBC Scotland would be the best place for the show given their dwindling viewers, but I'm delighted that you're watching us every week before the football on a Saturday morning. Now, to Alex's favourite part of the show, Scotland's Hidden Heroes, sponsored by Flagship Media. Over to Alex.
Somebody wrote in recently to point out that I hadn't featured any Scottish journalists in Scotland's Hidden Heroes as a series. Well, I suppose Fanny Wright was a journalist of sorts, but she was many other things as well. But that's true, and of course it's partly a comment on the lamentable state of Scottish journalism. However, through history, there have been certain Scottish journalists who are worthy of note, and that's why today I turn to Sir Alistair MacTavish Dunnett, or as I knew him better as All Dunnett. Alistair Dunnett was a remarkable man. He edited 2 national newspapers in Scotland after the War of the Daily Record, and then in the 1950s he was brought to the helm of the Scotsman newspaper by Roy Thomson, one of the great media moguls of the age. Now the Scotsman at that time was, well, a bit like it is now, a total backwater of a newspaper. Nobody was particularly interested in what it had to say, but in the mid-50s when Alistair Dunnett joined as editor, then he transformed the paper. He turned it into, quite simply, the voice of Scotland. He said, well, if the Scotsman isn't performing as the voice of Scotland, then who is and who will? And he employed some remarkable writers like Neil Asherson, like Norman Mayer, like John Rafferty, brought them to the Scotsman, and it became a place where good writing excelled, but above all, it was championing Scotland's cause, and doing so at a time when unionism was predominant in Scotland. When Alistair Dunnett became editor of the Scotsman, the Conservative Party had a majority of the votes in Scotland. But he didn't let that deflect him one iota from his mission, which was to deliver to Scotland as a minimum a federal parliament in a recognised nation. Now, I got to know Alistair in the early 1990s. Because he took to inviting me as the enfant terrible of Scottish politics, the young Robespierre, as Malcolm Rifkin once dubbed me. He took to inviting me to the New Club, because I think it tickled Alistair's sense of humour that we could have lunch in the New Club where he would dispense his views on what I should be doing in Scottish politics. Alistair was very concerned that we'd had a setback in the SNP in the 1992 election after such high hopes. And he was absolutely intent in making sure I didn't make any similar mistakes in the next election. And indeed, he was delighted when we made the progress in 1997. And of course, we won the referendum. And when Alistair died a year later, he died content that Scotland was well on the road to the restoration of the Parliament that he'd sought all his political life. But that wasn't the only claims to fame that this remarkable man had. He transformed the Scotsman newspaper. But he'd also been Tom Johnson's press secretary during the war, the greatest secretary of state for Scotland in history. It was Alistair Dunnett who used to go round the bookshops of Scotland buying up copies of our noble families, where Tom Johnston had taken the Scottish aristocracy to bits, but was sort of inconvenient to have them still in print when he was trying to recruit the same people onto his Council of State. How do I know this? Because Alistair Dunnett told me firsthand. Alistair understood Scotland extremely well. He knew the establishment of Scotland, he knew the common people of Scotland. He had a wit and a wisdom which was beyond compare. He also had a wicked sense of humour. I like to think it was the wit and the wisdom that he saw in me as someone who could help Scotland's cause. But there was also a bit of the sense of humour as well. He was married to Dorothy Dunnett, the famous historical novelist who survived him by a few years. But you know, when we look back on the figures who actually contributed to the momentum behind the national cause in the second half of the 20th century Scotland, then you would turn and look at a man like Alistair Dunnett, a man who took a backwater newspaper worth nothing and turned it into the national voice of Scotland. Maybe there's somebody listening who might try the same thing again, because that's why Alistair Dunnett is a very worthy addition to our pantheon of Scotland's hidden heroes.
Water is life, but not all water is equal. Our water ionizer restructures and alkalizes water for optimum hydration and detoxification, recreating the planet's ultimate water sources, found in lightning-struck lakes and newly melted icebergs. H2 Pure Source. Change your water. Change your life.
Professor Akbar Ahmed is a shining light in a dismal, dark world. For the last quarter of a century, he's been pursuing a personal and a global mission to try and provoke greater understanding between the Islamic world and the Western world. He has put so much effort into it, he's inspired so many people, and you saw from his eloquence today why he's been so effective. But nonetheless, the world gets ever more troubled, as he himself said, and we have the position of a conflagration in the Middle East. And Professor Akbar Ahmed, with his typical generosity, saw the difficulty, as he put it, of the American president in an election year restraining the state of Israel. But, you know, is that sufficient excuse to have stood by and allowed the slaughter of over 30,000 people in Gaza, largely women and children, over these last few terrible months? Is it really an excuse to arm a warmonger like Benjamin Netanyahu, somebody whose personal future depends on a continuation of conflict? Now, in this situation in the Middle East, there are very few heroes and very large number of people who bear a great burden of responsibility on all sides. But one thing is absolutely necessary if we are to bring about peace, certainly the understanding that Professor Akbar Ahmed has tried to spread, but also the peoples have to have a vested interest in securing a peaceful future. Now, those who want to survive, who want to live their lives, who want to grow with their families in that area, and the ordinary people have a huge vested interest in seeing a peaceful solution. But that also has to translate to the politicians and the vested interests and the powers in that area. And above all, if the Western world is to aspire to any sort of moral leadership, then you cannot arm a state which has massacred 30,000 people, many of them women and children. You just cannot do that. And that is why, although it's been deflected over the last few days by the Iranian missile attack, we have to get back to the argument that we shouldn't supply arms to those who want to perpetuate war. And we must invest in politicians who want to pursue peace, not those who want to continue conflict. Professor Akbar Ahmed says there are figures from history which should give us inspiration. His favourite is Saladin, the great giver of hope and faith and victory to the Islamic world in the 12th century. But also somebody, of course, who was known for his graciousness, his generosity, his chivalry towards his defeated opponents. And after the Saladin had retaken Jerusalem for the Muslims, a little known fact is he restored the Jews to their traditional city of faith. That was a gesture, something he didn't have to do, but something he did. And I think Professor Akbar Ahmed is absolutely correct to look into history to find sources of inspiration that would provoke better understanding between the Islamic world, the Western world, the countries in the Middle East, and human beings everywhere. If we can take from our joint collective history these moments of enlightenment and inspiration, then perhaps we can all work to make the world a better place.
And with that, we come to the end of this week's show, covering an extremely serious topic that affects all of us and will affect all of us in time to come. We do hope you've enjoyed our presentation on it. Now, we look forward to seeing you enormously next week. And I should say that I did have one tweet which I didn't read out, but I'll let you know what it said. It was somebody criticising my co-presenter, Mr. Alex Salmond, for giving Hamza Yusuf his first job. Now, as a lawyer, most things in life are entirely defensible. This one, less so. With that, we look forward to seeing you all next week at the same time before the football at 10 AM. And between now and then, you can watch us on every social media channel you can shake a stick at. Take care, and we shall see you all again next week.
This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.